Okay, so it's no secret that Honkai Impact and Honkai Star Rail are connected. I mean, they're both Honkai games, it's literally in the name, but there's always been a lot of speculation about how and to what extent these games are connected. Well, recently, the developers behind the Honkai series sat down to do an interview about this exact topic because they've just launched a collaboration event between Honkai Impact 3rd and Honkai Star Rail. And for those of us who don't speak Chinese, Chibi Pio happened to put together a really good translation of the article that I will link to in the description box if you'd like to read it for yourself. This article has some great answers to some long-standing burning questions within the community around XPs and how the games connect and potential future plans, so I wanted to go through the interview and highlight all of the parts that I thought were the most interesting. So I'm not really going to read this whole article aloud for you right now because I want to add some thoughts and commentary and a little bit of context that's not quite found in this interview. And I think that's enough preamble for now, so let's get to it, shall we? Okay, so I think we need to make one thing very clear from the get-go. The Honkai team has always intended for the worlds of Honkai Impact and Honkai Star Rail to connect in a meaningful way. In fact, as the Honkai story team was working on the final chapters of Honkai Impact Part 1, they were also thinking about what to do with the story after Part 1 finally finished. Honkai Star Rail is part of that. See, for years, Honkai Impact's story was only focused on the challenges faced by a single planet and the cosmic horrors that threatened it and its inhabitants. But as the main characters overcame those challenges, suddenly the story was no longer bound to a single planet. And that meant the writers were free to explore tons of new possibilities, new discoveries, new cultures, new planets, new challenges, you name it, it was now on the table. And this new era of Honkai, this new era of possibilities is part of what inspired Honkai Star Rail's story. Star Rail would be all about exploring the entire universe, one planet or space station at a time. And this also meant that they could write a different kind of story. Instead of just having one singular, more focused journey following a tight cast of characters fighting to protect their home and discovering who they are along the way like they do in Honkai Impact, Honkai Star Rail could be more of a fluid journey of journeys, like a story about lots of other stories. Not a single story, not a single journey, but something more like a story that contains countless interconnected but still independent stories. To put it another way, Honkai Impact is kind of on this little self-contained end of the spectrum, and Honkai Star Rail is way over here on this huge open-ended side of the spectrum. And the idea is for them to meet somewhere in the middle at some point. That's why the characters in Honkai Impact Part 2 are venturing beyond Earth's orbit and heading towards the edges of their solar system. The further they go, the closer they get to the greater universe of possibilities that we see in Honkai Star Rail. Which means that it is inevitable that these two games will cross paths. But that doesn't mean their individual stories will become one stories. They can still remain separate even though their setting is a shared one. Same universe, different focuses. But that said, even though the games share some core themes and world-building elements and quite literally share an in-game universe in ways that aren't quite clear to most of us yet, I do have to reiterate the fact that you do not need to play Honkai Impact 3rd to get the most out of Honkai Star Rail or vice versa. I mean, yes, because of the shared world-building elements, you're definitely going to get additional satisfaction from playing both games and seeing both sides of the equation, so to speak, but the writers have designed both games to be more or less self-sufficient when it comes to understanding what's going on. So while it is important to note that some story elements or characters may cross over a little bit, the stories themselves are designed to be independent and to work independently and to be able to be understood independently from each other. I like to think of it like this. So we've got Welt, right? Like, he's part of the main cast in Honkai Star Rail, but he's actually a character from Honkai Impact. He's not a variant or an XP, which we're going to talk about later, because he literally went into space in Honkai Impact, had a bit of a mishap, and then ended up on the Astral Express with no way to get home. So in Honkai Impact, he's marked as missing, and in Honkai Star Rail, he's actively looking for a way to get home, and learning more about the universe at large, since Earth has technically been isolated from the rest of the universe for so long that there's a lot to learn. And because we travel to so many planets in Star Rail, Earth is really just another planet, no different from Penacony or Eurilo 6. And every planet has its own long, storied history. It's just that in the case of Earth, its history is playable in another game. And personally, I think that's pretty cool, because most of the time in Star Rail, we only get to read about the events of history, we don't really get to play through them. And the same goes for the history of characters too, right? Like, yes, every Star Rail character has their backstory available in their profile for us to read, but only a couple of them can say that their backstory is a whole playable game, and well, just so happens to be one of them. So as a means of expanding the scope of a game in the case of Honkai Impact, I really do think the connection between the two games makes a lot of sense. But it also means that as the characters of Honkai Impact venture further beyond their solar system, their likelihood of coming into contact with things found in Star Rail, like the Eons, will increase dramatically. I did think that this might be kind of a tricky thing for Hoyoverse to handle since, you can't really take the characters out of their own main storylines for very long and just plop them into another game if certain events overlap, but the current collaboration event is a pretty promising test run of what might be on the horizon, so let's talk about that. So the main reason behind this interview is this crossover event that's going on in Honkai Impact 3rd, where Sparkle and Sampo from Honkai Star Rail are crossing over and causing a little mischief. According to the interview, Sparkle was explicitly chosen for this collaboration because she's a little bit of a trickster and also a little unpredictable. And this made her presence in another game a bit more believable, and she also had excellent chemistry with the featured Honkai Impact character for this event, Vita. Sparkle and Vita are similar types of characters. They're both a bit on the morally gray and playful side, so on the surface they seem to get along really well, but in reality they're both scheming against each other. This made for a really interesting dynamic between the two of them that the writers wouldn't have been able to achieve with characters like March 7th or Dan Heng. Plus, like I mentioned earlier, it's a lot harder to use the main cast directly in such a crossover because then the games would have to invent a reason as to why the Astral Express made it all the way to Earth when it was supposed to be elsewhere, and also Earth was hidden, and Welt is from Honkai Impact's Earth and he's also actively looking for it, so if the Astral Express ended up there, then the story would inevitably have to be about Welt returning home, and that would cause a lot of problems, right? Sparkle, on the other hand, doesn't need a reason to move between worlds, and Vita, well, I won't spoil her story or anything, but what I will say is that she canonically has the ability to travel freely within the cosmos and therefore between the worlds of both games. That's the reason why she was chosen for this collaboration on the Honkai Impact side. That, and also the fact that the main cast of Honkai Impact is also very busy with their own responsibilities, just like the crew of the Astral Express. So I think as long as Hoyoverse keeps this kind of believable consistency going on, collaborations between the two titles should work out just fine. And this is actually another reason why Sparkle is such a good pick for this sort of crossover stuff, because her playful, chaotic nature lends credence for her to pull some really silly stunts like integrating the UI interface of Star Rail into her combat mechanics in Honkai Impact, which is not a turn-based game, it's an action RPG. Can you think of a better character to break the fourth wall than Sparkle? Because I sure can't. And I have every reason to believe that Hoyoverse is really going to work hard on maintaining that believable consistency going forward as they start weaving the threads of these worlds and stories together. And a big reason why I believe that is that the writers themselves are loath to break a character's character. It's critically important that characters aren't forced to act in a way that doesn't align with their nature, nor should they be coerced into actions that feel unnatural for them just because it would be convenient for the writers. That's a quote from the article, by the way, that's not just something I'm making up on the spot. The writing team has made it very clear that they see the story as a vehicle to convey the strengths and charms of a character and not the other way around. You gotta respect a character's narrative will, so we can have some assurance that when considering future collaborations or crossovers or even lore and world building, that this kind of stuff will be taken into consideration first and foremost. Now, that said, not all collaboration or crossovers will be like Welt or Sparkle, appearing in both games completely unchanged. Most of the time, if and when we encounter a familiar face from another game, it won't be that character exactly, but a variant of that character. Now, what exactly do I mean by variant? Well, to the writers, every character they create has a sort of core, which I guess is like their soul or the heart of the character. It's what makes them recognizable as a character and includes some physical characteristics, unique personality quirks and tendencies, and that kind of stuff. It's like a character vibe check. Now, I like to think of a character's core kind of like its seed. Take an acorn, for example. An acorn will always grow up to become an oak tree. It can never become a pine tree or an apple tree or anything like that. But the environment the acorn is planted into plays a big role in how that acorn grows and the final shape that the tree takes. How big the final oak tree gets, how healthy it is, the patterns on its bark, the reach of its roots, all of that comes from the environment. So even though an acorn will always be an oak tree, the environment determines how that oak gets shaped. And that same logic applies to characters. Basically, Hoyoverse likes to take these character cores or seeds and then plant them in different situations and storylines and see how that environment would shape the way that character would develop. That is what a variant is. For a more practical example, let's take a look at Acheron. She's a variant of a character from Honkai Impact called Raiden Mei, or more accurately, the two share the same core, which makes them recognizable and identifiable, but also very different. After all, Raiden Mei and Acheron had very different environments that shaped their mental and emotional states in very different ways, and they also had two totally different backstories. So while it's easy to see their core similarities, it is just as easy to see how their individual experiences shaped them to become different, yet similar people. And as players, we also have different relationships with both Mei and Acheron because we meet them at different points in their journeys. We meet Mei in Honkai Impact when she's quite young, and we also get to witness every challenge she's ever faced, every change she's ever gone through, and so we understand her in a very different way than we do with Acheron. Because, we don't get to witness the past that shaped Acheron the way we did with Mei, because we meet her at a much later point of her own story, after she's done most of her maturing and overcome most of her challenges on her own. This gives her more of an air of mystery when compared to Mei, but at their core, both Mei and Acheron are compassionate, gentle individuals who try to help people around them in whatever way they can. The ways in which they can do this differ greatly, but the intent and heart behind it don't. Now, this variant system was put into place intentionally by the story team, and it allows them to explore all sorts of different possibilities for core characters simply by placing them in different environments. It also helps to create a sense of cohesion or interconnectedness between related titles. So Bronya, Sela, Luocha, Himiko, all of them are examples of this system. And I think it's kind of important to pay attention to this variant system, especially now of all times, because Honkai Star Rail is about to visit a new planet called Amphorius, and this planet seems to have a lot of recognizable variants from Honkai Impact. And I think this is really cool, but I also think I need to give you a little bit of context as to why I think it's really cool. And yes, the interview does actually talk about all of these things. I'm just also adding my own little opinion as we go. Anyway, sorry, sidebar. Okay, so in Honkai Impact, we have a world that's been facing a threat of cosmic horrors on a nearly eon-like scale for tens of thousands of years, and countless people dedicated their lives to protecting the Earth from the Honkai threat. One group of such individuals appeared around 50,000 years ago, and they called themselves the Flame Chasers. Together, they enacted many plans to try to counter the Honkai threat, even going so far as to augment their own bodies with genetic data from Honkai monsters. At the time, they were the sole hope for humanity's survival, and that is a lot of pressure for only 13 people to shoulder. Many of them died trying to prevent a great disaster, while a couple survived and attempted to enact a couple of backup plans. One of them involved launching a kind of arc into space that humanity could be revived with in the case of total annihilation. Another project, called Project Stigma, attempted to fuse the entire human population into one hive mind entity where they would live in a sort of dream world until the Honkai threat was no longer a threat. But in order for this dream world hive mind plan to work, one person would have to remain on the outside of the dream world, awake and alone forever. The Flame Chaser Kevin decided to bear this burden himself, and he had a heck of a time getting in a position where he could do that. Kevin managed to travel 50,000 years into the modern day through a combination of falling into an alternate dimension and other shenanigans that I promise make sense in context but require way too much time to explain properly right now. And then he tried to put his plan into action, but he was stopped by the main characters of Honkai Impact, Kiana, Bronya, and Mei, the three of whom had found another option to save humanity. Now, you'd think the fact they all wanted to save humanity would mean they'd try to work together, but Kevin was not convinced that their plan was any better than his. So for him to step aside, they had to prove that their plan was actually going to work. Obviously, the plan does work, and so he steps aside and everyone's happy. Now, the funny thing is, this whole thing with Kevin is a story that's actually mentioned in Honkai Star Rail. Welt shares it with Acheron and Penacony, perhaps because he suspects the events that will take place on Penacony are similar, and they are, or perhaps because Welt recognized Acheron as a variant of Mei who he both knew and who was involved in putting a stop to the Dream World plan. It's just kind of a cool nod to the parallelism between games. But okay, not only was Raiden Mei involved in stopping Kevin's plan, but she was also the one who unraveled the mysteries behind the Flame Chasers in the first place. By entering a sort of simulated environment called the Elysian Realm that the Flame Chasers left behind, Mei gets to meet the simulated ghosts of each Flame Chaser, and also learn the truth of the past from them. Discovering the truth for ourselves through a simulation was quite satisfying, but many, myself included, found themselves wondering what it would have been like to experience those events firsthand. After all, while the Flame Chasers gave their everything to instill the future with hope, their ends were still tragic, and despite their stories being some of my favorites in the entire game, I've always wanted to see if they could have had another, happier ending. And I think we might get the chance to see this with Amphorius, since many of the teased characters seem to be variants of the Flame Chasers. Like, there are 13 Flame Chasers in Honkai Impact, and there are 13 characters that were previewed for Amphorius. Some of these Amphorius characters are very easy to match their Honkai Impact variants, but others are less so. And that might be because a couple of these aren't variants from Honkai Impact, but actually variants from the announced Fate collaboration that's coming up. Like, I'm pretty sure that Maide is actually a variant of Gilgamesh from Fate, but we'll just have to wait and see how that pans out. And then there's a couple instances like Tribi, who I actually think isn't a Flame Chaser necessarily, but a reference to a character from the second part of Honkai Impact's story called Zenadina. But some of these are just really obvious, like Phainon is definitely a Kevin variant. There's no way that it could be anybody else. But regardless of how you want to match all of these characters to each other, it's still easy to see how the roles parallel each other. I mean, the Amphorius characters are even participating in the Flame Chase to save a dying world, which makes them Flame Chasers. And their world also seems to have some fun parallels to the Honkai Impact version. For example, in Honkai Impact, the Elysian Realm was a sort of interactive simulation. But in Honkai Star Rail, Amphorius can only be revealed using a mirror from the Garden of Recollection, which means that Amphorius is probably something like a recording of a world or an interactive memory. And honestly, that's not too far removed from the Elysian Realm simulation when you really think about it. And I could go on, and I probably will in a future video, but the last thing I want to add here is that I kind of feel like with all of these similarities, we've got a pretty good shot at Acheron making an appearance on Amphorius because she's a variant of May, and May was kind of a critical part of the Elysian Realm story. But like I said, the story of the Flame Chasers is one of my favorites from Honkai Impact, and I'm really excited to see these characters reimagined in a new world, in a new setting, with new context, and I'm hoping for a happier ending this time. I love exploring alternate possibilities. It's kind of like what I do as a theorist. On a more personal note though, I found this interview really interesting because I've been doing lore for Hoyoverse games for like 3 years now, I think. And in that time, I've got to see the launch of 4 new games. And honestly, it's been fascinating to watch these games mature. And this interview kind of helped me understand a little bit behind how Hoyoverse views their whole catalog of games and how their plans for the future are impacting the decisions they're making today and how they've been setting up this entire expansive experience for players in this crazy big universe that they've been working on for ages. It's been illuminating to say the least. But one thing I was really surprised to learn about was just how much the developers wanted to focus on the journey when it came to their games, rather than the destination. I mean, sure, that's a logical step for a live service game because, the point is to have continuous content, but the philosophy behind the decision is actually what I found most interesting. Partly because it reads like really good advice, and I think that's worth sharing and remembering. So I kind of want to read you a section of the interview, which I said I wasn't going to do, but I actually am, just this one little part. But I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit and adjust for translation clarity. So here goes. Historically, there were people who suffered much more than we do today, but they overcame hardships, and their perseverance is what our modern civilization is built upon. It's nothing short of a miracle. This miracle we witness when reading history is what allows us to have hope for the future, and we believe in the future of humanity. In today's world with the internet and globalization, everyone faces anxiety and confusion. In life, we are often forced to confront stress or suffering, but even in the midst of such suffering, we want people to know that they can always find a little happiness. In such situations, we believe that someone must take on the role of helping others discover these small moments of happiness and beauty in the world. And that is why, through the stories we tell, it is truly an honor for us if we can move players and give them courage to do just that. In creation, it's easy to want to add complexity or twists, but a story that continues to believe in the beauty of humanity and the world is a story that believes in the value of people, even if some think that this view is stupid or naive. And I think that is what the Honkai series is at its core, and that's what makes it special. So yeah, I just think this is kind of a neat philosophy, and a pretty rare one at that in today's era of nihilism. But I also think that's where I'm gonna leave things for today. Like I said in the beginning, if you want to read the full interview in English, I'm gonna leave a link in the description, and I'm also gonna leave a link down there to download Honkai Impact 3rd for those of you Star Rail players who had their interest piqued. Whether you just want to see what Sparkle's up to, or whether you want to see the roots of Honkai Star Rail, you're gonna be in for a good time. But that's all from me for today, folks. Thank you all so much for watching, take care of yourselves out there, and I will catch you in the next one. See ya!